Hello and welcome to this video on Mary Shelley, the author herself. I hope you're reading the book Frankenstein, written by Shelley in the early 1800s in England. And I wanted to just give you a quick overview of Shelley and some of her influences and some of the influences from her life that might make its way into her book. So let's start with Shelley. Shelley is the child of two very famous political philosophers, one named William Godwin and the other named Mary Wollstonecraft. And if you've seen Mary Shelley's name presented in full, it's Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, right? So she is the child of two political philosophers who are very well written and very well received. Her mother in particular was considered by some the first feminist author in many ways, coming out of England, arguing for women's rights and the women's rights to vote, etc. She also shares something, Mary Shelley shares something with her character Victor Frankenstein, in that her mother, also named Mary, dies about a month after Mary Shelley's birth. So Mary Shelley grows up with her father, never really knowing her mother. And so this tragedy that Victor Frankenstein experiences was one that Mary Shelley may have experienced, well, did experience herself. Perhaps not in the same way. This map is here because, as you can see, it's the British Isles, England to the south, Scotland to the north, and Ireland, of course, to the west. I'm bringing your attention to Dundee because though Mary Shelley spent a lot of her time in England, she did spend some formative time in Scotland, and in particular in Dundee, up here to the north. So we'll get to more of that. Many suggest that Scotland offered a lovely respite from the hustle and bustle of places like London, and that the landscape was very inspirational to Mary Shelley. We'll get to some pictures of that in a moment. So she was born in 1797. She dies in 1851. So given that historical setting, given that time period, we know that she is right in the throes of the scientific revolution and its effects on society. She's right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, changing England hand over fist. She is seeing cities bloom, cities become extraordinarily populated, even overpopulated, and very dangerous places to live. They can be dark from pollution. It's just a really significant change that happens within her lifetime to see these cities grow. Some suggest that one of the reasons her book is so interesting is because some of the themes in her book relate to the scientific revolution, right? And also the Industrial Revolution. That I see this in particular when Victor goes out to the countryside, when Victor leaves the city, when Victor leaves his laboratory, when Victor leaves the university and goes back home and is in the rolling hills in the countryside along the river. He seems to get his act together. He seems to be more sane. He seems to understand what's at stake. When he's in the city, when he's at the university, when he is sort of in the hustle and bustle and the too fast city, he loses control, he loses contact with who he is. So in that regard, that approach often is seen by English professors as a response to the industrial age, a response to the scientific revolution, suggesting that it's better to leave all that stuff behind, that our humanity is at stake. In that regard, this sort of makes this a romantic novel as well, right? So is it a response to the scientific revolution? Is it just a good old work of horror? Is it a response to the Industrial Revolution? Those are the things that you're going to be looking for as you read this book. I suggested we might take a look at Dundee, Scotland, where Mary Shelley spent some time. And I don't know if you can see this little church down here, just barely peeking through the bush, through the trees, and along this beautiful river. Scotland doesn't have many beautiful days with bright sunshine, but this is one of them. So rolling hills, a beautiful river, and just great expanses. These are a couple of other images of the River Tay that runs through Dundee, one in winter, one in spring. And again, some of the scenes that Shelley writes often involve being along the river, often involve these sort of idyllic countryside images. And this is just a beautiful church steeple, a church that would have been visible in Mary Shelley's day. Again, just a beautiful image of sunset along the Tay. Another important influence in Shelley's life was her husband, Percy Shelley, who many of you probably know as a poet, a writer, a very influential poet. And she, again, ran in very elite circles, literary circles, and she and Shelley were together for a while. They then married, and the inspiration for Frankenstein seems to come from a time when they were on a trip to Geneva, Switzerland, and while in Geneva, they managed to hole up along a lake at a great estate, a great house. Shelley, her husband Shelley, and several friends. And a terrible storm came up, and the weather was so awful that they all decided, we've got to stay in, we can't go out, the lightning's dangerous, etc. And so they decided to stay in, and they decided to entertain one another with stories. Right? There's no television, there's no iPhones and iPads, so we're doing storytelling. And they decided they would go with scary stories, ghost stories. And so this may have been, at least tradition maintains, this was the inspiration for Shelley coming up with Frankenstein. Of course, these are modern images, and Geneva, very famous for its skiing resort, but also here's a lovely image of Lake Geneva and a great fountain. So, beautiful place to visit today, just as it was in her day. This last map is just to give you an overview of the Arctic Circle and the Arctic Sea. If you'll recall, the book opens with letters from a man named Robert Walton, and he is writing letters to his sister about his great adventure, his great journey, to try to find the Northwest Passage, to try to find an ice-free passage to sail across the North Pole, right, say from England, which is where he starts, and then he finds himself in St. Petersburg, right here, trying to put together a ship and put together a crew. And what he wants to do is explore, and he wants to explore here into the Arctic Circle. He is looking for a Northwest Passage, trying to get across the North Pole into the other side of the world, and instead of having to go around Africa or somehow around South America in order to get to China and get to India. He's also interested in magnetic north. He'll mention several times in his letters that he's interested in finding out what is pulling a compass to the north, right? So he's looking. So he's a scientist. He's excited. He wants to find knowledge. You can tell he just can't wait to get going. And so he's writing letters to his sister about all the preparations and all that he's going to do as a great explorer and scientist. So he has the same kind of passion that Victor Frankenstein has. And he will be he'll serve as our narrator. He'll serve as the way that we get to talk to Victor. Right? So, just a short outline of the first few chapters. As you know, it opens up with a preface in which Shelley discusses some of her influences and her inspiration. This is interesting because Shelley's novel was immediately very popular. It went through several printings, which was really unheard of at the time. It was eventually made into a play, right, in her lifetime. And it had a lot of controversial critics. As you might have had, a lot of critics who said it was too controversial. There are issues of ethics, there are issues of science, religion. So there's certainly a lot of, and there's a lot of murder that goes on in this book. Sorry, spoiler alert. But so there were a lot of critics, and so she does spend a little time in the preface talking about her inspiration. It can be slow going. You may need a dictionary. You may need to read it twice. But that's the only time you'll hear Shelley speaking directly to you in those first few pages. It's then followed by a series of letters written by this explorer to his sister. These letters are fictional. However, the premise, as we've discussed, is not. Walton, the character here, is attempting to discover the Northwest Passage, and he's attempting to discover magnetic north. Right? So that's our setting. Walton's ship gets stuck in the ice. Once he gets going, he gets stuck. He's waited too late to get going, and the seas are freezing over. As they're stuck and waiting for the ice to shift, waiting for a thaw, and he and his men seem to have enough food to last, so they're prepared for this, strangers start to pass by. Visitors pass by. This is very odd, because they're on the sea, stuck in an ice floe, and people on sleds pass by. One goes on, and the other stops, half dead. Walton brings this fellow in, brings him into the ship, feeds him, restores his health, and the visitor, Victor Frankenstein, begins to tell his story. We learn of the tragedy in young Victor's life as his mother dies. We learn that Victor attends university. He's going to study science. But how will he approach it? There's this old alchemy, this old natural philosophy that he's intrigued by. And then there's also the new chemistry. And so that first couple of chapters will be talking about Victor struggling as to which teacher to work with. How will he proceed? What processes? What approach to science will he take? And this is very interesting because scientists of the day struggle too. Do I follow the old ways of natural philosophy, or do I follow the new science? In chapter 2, Shelley writes, the ancient teachers of this science, alchemy, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters of chemistry promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted, can't be changed. They know that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over microscopes or the crucible, have indeed performed miracles. So, what does this mean? The modern masters promise very little. Modern scientists don't promise miracles. The old alchemists did. The kinds of things the old alchemists promised was that they could turn lead into gold. If you know Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was supposed to be a special kind of stone that could make the properties of other things change. The elixir of life is a chimera. The elixir of life, the idea of being able to drink a potion and live forever, is a chimera. A chimera is a myth of old. But these philosophers, whose hands seem to only be made to dabble in the dirt, their eyes to pore over microscopes, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate, these new chemists, these new scientists, into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. That was all happening in Shelley's day. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven. They can mimic the earthquake and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. Electricity was just at this time being understood and being studied. This is the time of Ben Franklin with his little kite and his key. You'll see Shelley talk about galvanism, right? She's talking about electricity. So Victor tells Walton the whole story. His pursuit of science for science's sake, his ethical concerns, right? And there are some big ethical issues raised in this book. Shelley won't tell you about the creation scene, when Victor actually creates his monster, his creature, the life-breathing, animate human being. She doesn't show you that scene. That would maybe be too controversial, or maybe it's scarier for our imaginations to consider. We assume that electricity is involved. We do. And I have for you this one image, and we'll see how it plays on this video, but I have for you this one image. Now, this is from a very early version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, an early 20th century Hollywood version. So let's take a look and see how it goes. We might get interrupted by a commercial, so bear with me if that's the case. And we'll see how this comes up. Let's see if it will play for us. I think it might. Here's Dr. Fox saying hi. Let's see. Here we go.
Yes? Eh? Quite a good scene, isn't it? One man crazy, 3 very sane spectators. It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!